In March 2020, as everyone was raving about the excellent Revolution and scratching their heads at the main event of Elimination Chamber, the world shut down. Cody Rhodes and Triple H opened their respective shows addressing the lack of a live crowd as a result of the pandemic. Both WWE and AEW continued their weekly shows, but losing such a fundamental element of professional wrestling forced them to get creative in the way they presented their products. From having wrestlers play as a crowd to the introduction of the Thunderdome, WWE and AEW played different tactics to help us forget the depressing state of the industry and the world as a whole. One of their strongest tools were cinematic matches that, although brought out mixed results in the past with the likes of the Boiler Room Brawl, the House of Horrors match, and the Final Deletion, became saviors for those matches most affected by the silent arenas. So, as we close a year since the first two cinematic outings, I decided to look back at every cinematic match that took place ever since, from both major companies, and rank them from worst to best. Let's begin! At number 12, Adam Cole vs the Velveteen Dream in the Backlot Brawl. This is probably the least interesting and the most unnecessary match in the list. From very early on, it was just generic brawling and lots of stalling around the backlot, without the creativity a cinematic match gives them. If anything, it felt more like a parking lot brawl with all the cars around the ring. But even then, aside from Cole falling off of a ladder onto a windshield, there were few spots that used them in any interesting manner. There were also short appearances by the Undisputed Era and Dexter Lumis, which were fine, but did not match to the overall bout. Aside from the spot I mentioned, and maybe the ending sequence, this encounter is totally skippable. At number 11, Bray Wyatt vs Braun Strowman in the Wyatt Swamp Fight. This encounter felt like a poorly executed mix of two of the best received cinematic matches of the year. Most of the first half focused on getting into the psyche of Braun, which didn't work because Braun isn't that complicated of a character, and his run in the Wyatt family wasn't very memorable in the first place. The second half featured some okay brawling, limited by the watery environment, as well as an overload of creepy imagery. There were a couple of cool moments, like Braun beating knockoff Harper and Rowan down and setting one of them on fire, and Alexa Bliss's cameo, which was mildly interesting and served as a teaser of things to come. Other than that, this encounter failed to get me invested into this feud, and if anything, was the last straw in people getting tired of the overuse of cinematic matches. At number 10, Dexter Lumis vs Cameron Grimes in the Haunted House of Terror match. The Lumis-Grimes feud was very bizarre, with blindfold and strap matches, but this pseudo-short horror movie easily takes the cake. It was your average horror story, with Lumis cast as a silent monster, and Grimes as the cocky and scary victim who spent 90% of the match either running away from danger or screaming at the top of his lungs before being put to sleep and surrounded by zombies as a literal end screen appeared. As a whole, this was very dumb and silly, but ultimately harmless encounter that didn't take itself too seriously. Realistically, it probably should rank lower, but Grimes saved it with his over-the-top performance that made this more entertaining than it had any right to be. At number 9, Big Swole vs Britt Baker in the Tooth and Nail match. The Baker-Swole rivalry was featured quite heavily throughout the summer, despite the fact Baker was injured the whole time, which just might be the reason the eventual encounter was this weird brawl at Baker's dentist office. It had a number of decent spots, like Swole tossing Reba into a dumpster, and the ending sequence with the syringe and anesthesia, but they were mixed with so-so acting that was much more noticeable than it would have been in a regular match. I can't honestly say it was downright bad, but I've got to admit it was a bit cringy at times. However, it was still a fun little bout with a creative ending that didn't outstay its welcome and worked well enough with its unique setting. At number 8, Johnny Gargano vs Tommaso Ciampa in one final beat. There is a bunch of negative stuff to get out of the way when speaking of this feud-ending clash. From the lack of commentary, to the excessive cuts, to the overly dramatic monologues, to the unnecessary length. This was in serious danger of entering Edge vs Randy Orton and WrestleMania territory, but its mix of solid spots and actually good wrestling saved it from being a full-on bore fest. and made it an acceptable marquee match. The low blow ending was a bit deflating, but it led to Gargano and Bray doing some top-notch character work all year long, so it wasn't for nothing. There's definitely something to enjoy here, but even without a crowd, this encounter would have really benefited from being just a regular unsanctioned match instead of a cinematic brawl. At number 7, Jeff Hardy vs Sheamus in a bar fight. Ignoring how inappropriate the whole Jeff is an alcoholic storyline and all of its trashy segments were, this encounter was way better than anyone expected. It utilized its location pretty well, with constant action across the entire place, and some creative spots to reduce most of the generic brawling until the end. Speaking of which, it was kind of a mixed bag, since I wasn't the biggest fan of Jeff suddenly having his face paint on and hulking up, but it didn't take away too much from the final spot, which looked great. I ranked it higher than a few of the more high-profile entrants simply because the overall presentation of the match just seemed more fun and lively, and at just 10 minutes, it is one of the easiest matches on the list to recommend. At number 6, Decline the Corporate Money in the Bank ladder match. This is easily the most divisive match on the list. On paper, the idea of taking the Money in the Bank ladder match concept to the extreme and making it a race atop WWE headquarters was inspired. Just seeing all of these wrestlers brawl around so many different settings, all with a clear end goal, made for a broad and thrilling watch. However, the entirety of the match, up to its final moments, leaned heavily on the more comedic side, with some genuinely funny moments, but also a few lame ones, as well as a bunch of cameos that felt, for the most part, awkward and forced. But in the end, despite all of its flaws, and the fact neither of the winners actually got to cash in, it was still a very entertaining encounter that gave us two shocking winners, which at the time felt like a refreshing and exciting end to a pay-per-view. At number 5, Brooke and Matt Hardy vs Sammy Guevara in the Elite Deletion match. Now this was kind of unnecessary. People were ready to move on from this rivalry after a series of dangerous and harmful spots on TV and pay-per-view, but I guess they still wanted to have a proper ending. Thankfully, this was a deletion match, giving us more assurance no one would get badly hurt. As for what happened in the match, it took a bit to really get going, with the initial brawling around the forest being just okay. However, once Santana, Ortiz, and Private Party joined the fray, it really picked up with some fun tag spots, followed by a fireworks war and the surprise appearance of the Hurricane and Gangrel, who added some decent comedy to the match. The final segment inside the warehouse was a pretty good hardcore brawl, though the callback to their botch from All Out was kind of uncomfortable to watch. Regardless, it was still a very entertaining match and a gratefully injury-free ending to the feud. At number 4, The Undertaker vs AJ Styles in the Boneyard match. This was easily going to be the match most hurt by the lack of a live crowd, had it gone according to the original plan, especially in Taker's current condition. Thankfully, the decision to have a cinematic match not only saved it, but actually improved the final product. Their match ended up being just as bonkers as expected, with Druids joining the fight, Gallows and Anderson canonically dying, and Taker using his trademark supernatural powers to get the upper hand, all while feeling like an extended movie scene, with both men absolutely delivering in their performances. The only issue I have with the bout was that it was a bit too one-sided for my liking, with AJ looking kind of weak, but not enough to hurt it in any significant way. Overall, a worthy last hurrah for the Deadman, assuming his retirement as Survivor Series will stick. Before moving on to the top 3, I'll go through a few matches I didn't rank for a reason or another, but I still wanted to mention. Edge vs Randy Orton in the greatest wrestling match ever. This was an excellent match with a fancy presentation that featured a bunch of additional unique shots that, while neat, didn't add much to an already brilliant bout. The Street Profits versus the Viking Raiders versus Akira Tozawa and his ninjas, I guess. This wasn't an official match, but the random flashbacks and overproduced introduction of Tozawa's ninja gimmick were quite memorable, even if the whole thing was pretty dumb. Matt Jackson versus Nick Jackson. This unique fight in the Young Bucks property was part of the 200th episode of Being the Elite, and in all honesty was way better than expected, making it very recommendable since it's freely available on YouTube. Randy Orton versus The Fiend Bray Wyatt in the Firefly Inferno match. This was mostly a standard Inferno match, except for the entire burning of the Fiend ending. It was fine for what it was, and had a cool looking final visual, but not really my thing. And finally, Alexa Bliss versus Randy Orton. This was a showcase of all the supernatural nonsense that has plagued this storyline, to the point that not even the return of the Fiend was able to salvage it for me. Back to the list. At number 3, Sting and Darby Allin versus Brian Cage and Ricky Starks in a street fight. This was the last full-on cinematic match we had, so before I praise the hell out of it, I have to acknowledge how out of place it felt after 3 months without one, and especially after Sting took a big bump on Dynamite. Nonetheless, this was still a very unique brawl around an abandoned warehouse, with a mix of neat camera shots, rough-looking spots, and the rest of Team Taz getting involved for the sake of variety. Allin did most of the heavy lifting, both taking some painful-looking damage from his much bigger opponents, and doing a number of eye-catching moves, especially his finishing blow on Cage that was equally shocking and not surprising at all coming from Darby. Sting did his part well enough at the start and mostly in the final in-ring segment against Starks. The reason this one stands so high on the list is mostly because it captured the right tone so many others failed, all while making the participants look better than when they arrived, which was all we could ask after the less than stellar build. At number 2, Bray Wyatt versus John Cena in the Firefly Funhouse match. This is undoubtedly the most unique encounter on the list, with the entirety of the thing being a retrospective look at John Cena's career, from his debut against Kurt Angle back in 2002 to his days as the Doctor of Thuganomics, to Cena's position at the face of the company, to the almighty what if that was the possibility of a heel turn, to Cena wronging Wyatt at WrestleMania 30. This all led into a brilliant ending sequence, with Cena's words echoing in the background as Wyatt got rid of the most overhyped, overvalued, and overprivileged star in WWE history. This was so different from anything WWE has ever produced, it effortlessly became the most talked about match out of the 2 nights of Mania. This was the rare occurrence where we, as an audience, were actually rewarded for making sense of this story by remembering details and results of the past. It would make more sense to rank this as a short movie instead of any kind of actual in-ring competition, but a match as captivating as this one deserves all the kudos it's got and more. However, there's still one match I liked just a bit more. At number 1, The Elite versus the Inner Circle in the Stadium Stampede match. With so many interesting and wild ideas all year long, taking us across several fun and wacky locations, it's the match that had the most variety that came out on top. From the entire starting segment that was full on spot-filled indie wrestling, to Paige and Hager brawling in a bar, to Matt Jackson hitting Northern Light suplexes across the whole field, to seeing all the faces of Matt Hardy, to Jericho hitting the Judas effect on the Jaguars mascot. There was so much stuff going on, and that's just scraping the surface of this 34-minute parade of insanity. It squeezed the most out of its setting and out of the wrestlers' skills, seamlessly juggling all 10 of them. In the end, after the rest of the Inner Circle was taken care of, Kenny Omega put an end to one of the first major stories in AEW's history with a bang by putting Sammy Guevara through a platform with an insanely high one-winged angel. This was the epitome of what I like about cinematic matches. It was different, it was funny, it was ridiculous. It took what I love about pro wrestling and put it under entirely unique conditions, making it one of the most delightful experiences I've had as a wrestling fan in a long time, and my favorite cinematic match of the past year. Do you agree with my ranking? Leave a comment down below with your favorite cinematic match. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow me on Twitter at Pomi Wrestling for any update. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time, see ya!